The first step of support, so the lowest level of support that can be provided to vulnerable children in this country, is early help. And early help derives from Section 10 of the Children Act 2004 and from the Working Together to Safeguard Children guidance, which was last updated in July 2018. Early help means providing support as soon as a problem emerges. The idea is that early help should prevent needs of a vulnerable child from escalating to a point where a higher level of intervention by social services is required, either for that child as a child in need or for child protection purposes. The legal system requires that local authorities, social services, make arrangements for cooperation with relevant partners to improve the well-being of all children in their area. And relevant partners are organisations such as health services, the police, education services. The local authority social services must make arrangements for those partners to cooperate with them to support and improve the well-being of vulnerable children in the area. Those relevant partners have a corresponding duty to cooperate with the local authority social services in order to achieve this. This means that effective sharing of information between organisations is essential. And it's essential because it aids early identification of needs, adequate assessment of those needs, and enables those relevant partners to actually provide services to meet needs. This has been an issue that has come up a number of times in the MAC project, as advocates that we've worked with have told us that sometimes different organisations, different public bodies are reluctant to share information. The Working Together guidance tells us that fear about sharing information must not stand in the way of the need to promote welfare and to protect the safety of children. So it's important to bear that in mind when you are interacting with the local authority social services or with those other bodies who might be involved in provision of early help. The legal scheme then requires that local authorities make arrangements to provide early help services, and I'll detail what kind of services are considered to be early help services shortly. At this point, I want to make it clear that although early help is sometimes thought of as something that's quite wishy-washy and unimportant, because it is a low level in our series of steps in terms of the total scheme for protecting vulnerable children, it is actually a vital step. And the court proceedings and pre-proceeding statutory guidance of 2014 tells us that providing early help is more effective in promoting the welfare of children than reacting later. It's interesting because that guidance is intended to cover practice where care proceedings are contemplated. So right at the high scale, right at the end of our scheme, where you're looking at removing a child potentially from the care of their parents. And yet, even at that point, that very high level, the guidance tells us that the most effective thing to do is to put in place early help. So it's really important that it's not thought of as something that's unimportant or wishy-washy, but rather that it's something that really is quite substantial in terms of the impact it can have on vulnerable children and their families, and in terms of its ability potentially to prevent an escalation of need to a point where child protection is necessary. Early help works by local agencies coming together to identify those who would benefit from additional support, and by enabling those agencies to undertake an assessment of the particular needs of a child and their family for early help support. Following on from an assessment, targeted early help services to address the assessed needs of that child and their family can be put in place. Early help can be provided to all children, and that includes unborn children. It also includes children who are disabled, children with special educational needs, young carers, children who might be missing from home, children whose family circumstances might present problems for the child, children at risk of radicalisation, children who are privately fostered, and those returning to a family from care. So the idea is that any child who might be vulnerable can access support potentially through the early help scheme from the local authority. I said that in order to access early help, partners need to undertake an assessment of particular need. This assessment is undertaken by a lead professional, and that's not usually a social worker. It's usually a family support worker, a teacher, a health visitor, somebody from one of those relevant partners with whom the local authority has to work to deliver early help. And this is important because sometimes mothers or parents can be concerned if the local authority is getting involved and if a social worker is going to come and do an assessment of them. But these assessments happen at a lower level and in a way which doesn't necessarily entail social services doing the assessment themselves, and can be done by professionals who are already working with a family and who might have built up a rapport with them, might have a pre-existing relationship which enables them to really work with the family to understand what the particular difficulties are facing them and what support might be provided that would meet the needs of the children within the family. The role of the lead professional undertaking the assessment isn't just limited to finding out what needs are, but is also to act as an advocate on behalf of that child, that family, in terms of helping them to access any support that they might need or to explain or communicate what their needs are. And the lead professional is responsible for coordinating service delivery. So once an assessment has been done and has identified particular needs and what services would benefit a family to meet those needs, the lead professional is responsible for ensuring those services are then put in place. Early help assessments, because they're outside the scope of a social services assessment, can only be done with the consent of a child and or their family, depending on the age of that child. If a child or their family refuse to consent to an assessment being done, then the lead professional must consider whether it's likely that needs will escalate to a point where that child will become a child in need, or where there are child protection concerns about that child. And if the lead professional is concerned that needs are likely to escalate, if no assessment for early help is done, and if no early help support is put in place, then the lead professional should refer that child to the local authority social services. Additionally, if a lead professional thinks that the needs of a child go beyond support that can be provided through early help, and that child is likely to be a child in need, they should refer that child to the social services department for an assessment. Once an assessment has been done, the lead professional needs to think about what particular services would meet the needs of that child. And early help services can then be provided. Now, these services can be universal services or specific early help programs. Universal services are accessible by all. So you might wonder, well, what's the point of having an early help assessment if at the end it might just be identified that access to universal services is required? Well, the difference between accessing those services through early help is that a lead professional is responsible for coordinating delivery of those services, which means that if there are universal services that are restricted in terms of limited numbers of people can access them, or there's waiting lists, then actually if you access that support through early help with the assistance of a lead professional coordinating service delivery, it might be that you can bypass those queues, or you can access support even if you might otherwise be prevented from getting to because of limited places or waiting lists, etc. So even if the outcome of an early help assessment is access to universal services, it can nevertheless be a useful step to have gone through an early help assessment, identifying that your child requires that service. Early help can also include specific early help programs, and these are wide-ranging in terms of what the local authority can provide. The Working Together guidance tells us that early help programs can include things that are particularly useful to young mums and their babies, such as, for example, family and parenting programs, services to improve family functioning. So that might be around domestic violence work, or it might be around money management, services to build a family's own capacity to solve problems. There are others, that's not an exhaustive list, but those kinds of programs, those kinds of specific early help services that can be accessed are of particular importance and relevance to young mums who have themselves been looked after or who are still looked after. In order to find out what early help services are available in your local authority area, the best place to look is on the local Children's Safeguarding Board's threshold documents, or protocol documents they're sometimes called. And you can obtain these through your local Children's Safeguarding Board website usually. The Working Together guidance requires that those safeguarding boards publish the type and level of early help services available in their area. So that means if you go to that document, you should be able to obtain a list of the types of provision or the particular services that are delivered as early help services in your area. The other thing that's important about those threshold or protocol documents is that they should set out very clearly where that particular local authority considers the boundary lies between early help needs and needs which are considered to fall on one of the other steps of the scheme to support vulnerable children, to protect vulnerable children. So it should be very clear from the protocol document, the threshold document, whether a local authority is likely to consider a particular kind of need, a need for early help support, or a need for child in need, Section 17 support, or a need which would give rise to a child protection intervention. The threshold document, therefore, should also set out what the criteria for making a referral to social services is, if, as an advocate or as a lead professional, as a person involved with a vulnerable family, a vulnerable child, you think that the needs go beyond what early help could deliver. As an aside, it's very important to say that the threshold documents themselves must be consistent with the law. Now that sounds obvious, but we, community care and public lawyers, whilst doing MAC project work, have come across threshold documents for some authorities, which themselves seem to be quite questionable legally. For example, Section 17 for child in need support, which we'll go on to consider in the next section of these series of webinars, it defines what a child in need is, and that definition includes a disabled child. But some thresholds, some protocols don't automatically consider a disabled child to be a child in need. Now we think that's quite problematic because the threshold seems to be setting the level of the local authority's duties differently from what the legislation, what the statutory scheme under the Children Act actually says. So those threshold documents are important in that they tell us how individual local authorities will treat children whose needs are of a certain type or nature. But just remember that those threshold documents, those protocol documents, are not themselves the law, that they must also comply with the law, which is the legislation, the acts, the regulation, and the legal guidance.